Hello, my name is Noah Sachs. Today's guest is Dr. Arne Güllich. He is the head of the sports science department at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern in Germany. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles. His areas of focus include youth sport, talent development and elite sports, and sports development and sports organizations. Dr. Güllich has experience coaching at the junior and Olympic levels. He also worked in the German Olympic Sports Confederation, focusing on talent development. This is my conversation with Dr. Arne Güllich. Thank you, Dr. Güllich, for taking the time to speak with me today. You recently published a paper called What Makes a Champion? Early Disciplinary Practice, Not Early Specialization, Predicts World-Class Performance. And you've also published many other papers since then and before that. But I first kind of wanted to touch on your background in the field and your journey to where you've been today, and then go into the key findings of this specific paper.
Okay, my background, I was an athlete, mostly up to regional level, sometimes a bit more, in athletics. I also have experience as a coach. I coached children, I coached adolescents, and I also had the privilege of coaching a few Olympic athletes who made it to the Olympic Games and World Championships. And my professional background is, besides having been a coach, I worked in the German Olympic Sports Confederation for 12 years. I had various positions, but this always included responsibility for talent development in Germany. And 14 years ago, I switched back to the university, and I have a professorship. I'm the head of the Department of Sports Science of the University of Kaiserslautern.
Okay. And from there, this specific research, what were the key findings on that paper that you were working on relatively recently?
Right. So this is a review and a meta-analysis of all research that has been done by others and by ourselves. So original studies were synthesized. We had a very large sample that included more than 9,000 athletes, more than 200 international gold medalists, more than 470 international medalists. So and the sample actually covered all types of Olympic sports and all kinds of performance levels from the local to the Olympic level. The major findings were that the predictors of early junior performance and of long-term senior performance are not only different, but that they're opposite. What did we study? We studied participation variables. That was our research interest. Participation variables in terms of at what age did they start playing their main sport, what amount of practice did they do under the supervision of a coach in their main sport and in other sports, but also what amount of peer-led or youth-led sport did they do, so in informal settings without a coach. Some would say deliberate play or something like that. So playing basketball in the driveway with friends, playing soccer in the schoolyard, and so on. Okay, so we wanted to know the amounts of those activities within childhood and adolescence, but also the accumulated amount across the entire career and up to one's career peak. The major results were the following. Higher performing youth athletes differed from lower performing youth athletes in that they started playing their main sport at a younger age. They achieved developmental performance milestones at a younger age. Performance milestones would be, for example, first participation in a national championship, first participation in an international championship, first nomination for a selection team. So the higher performing youth athletes achieved those milestones at a younger age than the lower performing youth athletes. The higher performing youth athletes also accumulated greater amounts of coach-led practice in their main sport than the lower performing youth athletes, but they did less coach-led practice in other sports. peer-led play had negligible effects, both peer-led play either in one's main sport or in other sports, negligible effects on both youth performance and senior performance. Now, senior performance, we were particularly interested in what makes the difference between the highest performance levels. So we compared senior world-class athletes with senior national class athletes. And world-class was defined as being among the top 10 of the world in one's main sport. The major findings were that the senior world-class athletes differed from the senior national class athletes in that they had started playing their main sport at a later age. They achieved those performance-related developmental milestones at a later age than the national class athletes. They accumulated significantly less coach-led practice in their main sport, by the way, at any age of their career, be it in childhood, adolescence, or in adulthood, less main sport practice, but they did significantly more practice in other sports.
Okay. And relatively, in my opinion, when I read it, very interesting and somewhat surprising findings probably for a lot of people, because what I take from that is that, okay, being successful at a youth level did not predict being successful at a senior level, senior meaning at an adult level. Whereas a lot of people would think, oh, if, I'm cruising through, I'm doing really well as a junior, I'm going to then succeed at that elite level when I'm an adult as well. What were the things that surprised you with the results? Was there anything that you saw that was surprising?
Not really regarding the content of the findings. I mean, we knew the literature before, we knew the studies. We had done a number of primary studies ourselves, and maybe a surprise was how pronounced the results were and how consistent they were in terms of opposite predictors of junior success versus senior success.
Yeah. And I want to get into one question I really found, or when I was reading it, is this coach-led versus youth-led? What is because it sounded like from what you just said that coach-led practice is very important. Can you expand upon that element of your research, between the differences and why they might be from your perspective on why one is more important than the other?
Right. Okay. So within one's main sport, I think it is obvious that you need a lot of practice and you need support in your practice by a coach, because the coach is more expert than you are, especially when you're a child or adolescent, right? The differentiation between coach-led practice and peer-led youth or youth-led sport was particularly interesting when referring to the other sports the athletes did. And here we find that doing a lot of coach-led practice in other sports facilitated long-term senior performance, whereas doing a lot of peer-led sports in other sports did not. Now, the reason why the effect of peer-led play was not significant is twofold. First, the effect, or the mean effect across all studies, was low. But it was also the situation of research was extremely heterogeneous. So there were a number of studies who revealed strong positive effects of the amount of peer-led play on one's performance, but there were also other studies that reported strong negative effects. Right. So in short, we may sum up. I would rather say that the question is not clarified scientifically yet.
Okay.
But so far we cannot responsibly say that peer-led play facilitates long-term performance development.
Understood.
And maybe, because you're asking for the difference. I would most probably guess that the difference is, I would call it authenticity. Because when you do coach-led, importantly, those athletes, those world-class athletes, they did coach-led practice in other sports for 8 years on average, right? They competed in those other sports for 6 years on average. And third, they did not do as many other sports as possible. They typically did 1, 2, or 3 other sports. Now, importantly, they competed in those other sports. And that tells us that it must have been cultural practice, because you have to be in a different organization, different club, or a different department, and so on, to compete in another sport. And that's why we know that they did practice with a specialist coach in those other sports. And that makes the experiences they had in those other sports authentic, and that it was long-term, multiple years, it was performance-related, and it was with a specialist coach in that sport. And that probably included a variety of learning processes that were instructed by specialist coaches in those sports, different tasks, different learning situations, different learning methodologies, and so on, that you would not have in peer-led play in other sports.
And that's also sort of what, when I read the paper, when you present this alternative hypothesis, one of those 3 interrelated hypotheses has those 2 sub-elements, and I covered those in my interview with Dr. Hambrick as well, is kind of this potential for the experiences you're gaining working with other coaches, other environments, then prepares you to kind of later on be more aware of how you work, how you develop best. So I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that fits into this idea of you're competing for 6 years, and in your non-primary sport competitively, you're being exposed to these other coaching styles, team dynamics, individual sport dynamics. Does that make sense, or am I wrong
Absolutely.
there?
Absolutely, yes. So that's what we hypothesize. There is tentative empirical evidence to support our hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis, right? That remain to be tested in future research. So our hypotheses were 3. The first one is, if you have authentic experience in different sports, the probability that you choose one main sport at which you're particularly talented is multiplied. Second, youth athletes who engage in various sports have a reduced risk of future overuse injuries. Yes, and the third hypothesis is what you refer to. So the idea is that those athletes, based on the learning experiences they have in different sports, different tasks, so a broader range of tasks and a greater number of total tasks that they learn, right? Different learning situations, different coaches, different learning methodologies, learning designs, and so on. As a result, this enlarges their learning capital for future learning in their main sport at a very high level. So the engagement in other sports other than one's main sport, through childhood and adolescence, does not have a direct effect on one's performance in your main sport, but rather a delayed effect, delayed by multiple years, and it's a moderatory effect in that it makes you a smarter learner, which facilitates your later progress and performance in your main sport. In other words, it makes your practice in your main sport more efficient because you have greater progress per invested training time.
And before we move on and try and change gear a bit, one term that comes up in the paper is this ecological dynamics theory. And it's something I've read a lot about and I'm really interested in. But for listeners, can you talk about what is ecological dynamics theory? Because it can sound a bit intimidating. And also, how does it relate to the context you were talking about it in the paper?
Yes, with pleasure. May I just go back to what was the situation of research over the last decade? So
Sure.
There were mainly 3 broad concepts of talent development. That was the idea of deliberate practice from Anders Ericsson, the idea of deliberate play, which was part of Jean Coutet's developmental model of sport participation, and the idea of giftedness, mostly proposed by François Gagné. These were the 3 most popular talent development concepts in the scientific literature, right? While ecological dynamics has only come up and gained popularity more recently. The problem about those first 3 concepts, I'm not saying theory, but concepts, and I'll tell you why. a good theory has to meet two criteria of truth. That is, the first one is internal consistency, and the second one is there has to be empirical correspondence. Those three concepts of talent development are all internally consistent. So the first criterion is met, but the premises are all inconsistent with the empirical evidence. So the second criterion, which is crucial, is just not fulfilled by those three concepts. So they're not theories, right? Ecological dynamics has a similar status at the moment. It came up about 20 years ago in sports science and has gained popularity through maybe the last 10 years or so. Okay, first I will tell what is the idea of ecological dynamics, right? Before, performance was mostly regarded with a focus on the athlete himself, him or herself. The difference in ecological dynamics is that they propose that the performance is always the result of an interaction between a task, a performer, and the environment. So to give you an example, our movements vary. Nobody of us has ever done two walking steps that are identical. They always differ. They always vary, right? In addition, in some sports, situations may vary, right? So the quarterback in a football match will never meet two identical situations, but the other player, his teammates, the opponents, they will always vary in positioning and so on, right? So at every moment where we want to perform a task, we have to adapt to the situation, and the situation is the environment, right? So that's the idea of ecological dynamics. That's the first point. And the second point is that skilled performance emerges from a variety of possible solutions of a task within one individual, right? And that's the relatedness to the findings that we presented, because ecological dynamics assumes that variability of motor learning experience is important to improve specific skills, right? Now, we did write that our findings are consistent with the thoughts and the ideas of ecological dynamics. At the same time, we have to say that the situation of empirical research regarding ecological dynamics is that we have quite a number of very good research on motor control so performing tasks, right? But there is not research on multi-year motor learning. There is a certain discrepancy in what the proponents of ecological dynamics claim and suggest or even recommend to practitioners regarding long-term multi-year motor learning processes and the empirical substantiation.
Understood. And if I'm right, also some of the earlier work, this idea, at least what resonated with me, is from Nikolai Bernstein working with blacksmiths. I don't know what time period that was early on, and identifying that expert blacksmiths, they don't all have the same movement every time when striking. And I think conceptually, I appreciate that you bring up the fact that there's still room for discrepancies, and it's not clear yet if it's 100% accurate. But to me, it's a very big shift from thinking, especially even just in the golf swing, thinking that, so it's not realistic to expect that the movement, I'm not actually trying to repeat the movement every time exactly the same. Actually, if I'm an advanced level golfer or athlete in general, there's good variability. There's not bad variability, but there's good variability. And actually, lack of variability is an indicator of being somewhat more of a novice person in a certain field. Absolutely.
Yeah, the conclusion is correct.
Yeah.
So that's what the proponents of ecological dynamics would suggest. Mm-hmm. Because we're not able to do a golf swing identically 2 times. Every golf swing you've ever done in your life differs from all others in some way, right? It may be minute, but it still does. And that signifies that it is not an automatized scheme that you just, so to say, push the button and it runs. But you're always controlling and readjusting your movement during the movement, right? So learning skilled task performance is learning to readjust the movement while executing it. That's the point. It's not just going through an automatized scheme like the computer model, for example, right? Thus far, the idea of ecological dynamics is very well established, and there is good empirical research to substantiate those findings. Now, the conclusion or the transfer to motor learning is highly plausible. So if skilled performance is readjustment of my movement during the movement, this suggests that a greater variability in practice should be beneficial to my skilled performance. It is plausible, it is logical, it is logically stringent, but we're still lacking the empirical evidence to really substantiate that regarding motor learning processes over long periods. I mean, we're talking about 10 or more years.
Yeah. So the last question I had before I switch, I wanted to get into really these talent development pathways. I know you've talked a lot about those and other research I've seen you do and speeches you've given. But to touch on when I talked to Dr. Hambrick about, deliberate practice, because really what we've talked about so far goes against this notion of, I want my kid to play on the PGA Tour or LPGA Tour, so I'm going to start him at 3 years old, and he's going to deliberately practice until he's 18, and then he's going to be successful, go to Division I college, and then he's going to be on the PGA Tour. And really, the evidence that you've presented, and I think the overall evidence would suggest that that is definitely not the right approach. Even though there are examples, Tiger Woods, that have had success, those are the exception, not the rule. So did you want to say anything more about this deliberate practice? Because I know it's a very widespread, popular thing. For maybe you can explain why it became so popular. But yeah, I'd let you just maybe speak on this idea of deliberate practice.
Right. Yeah, it was a great pleasure. Thank you. So deliberate practice was first published in a classical article of Anders Ericsson and his colleagues in 1993. They investigated young violinists. They had a mean age of 23. So the central idea was there's a certain type of practice, which they labeled deliberate practice, which is doing many repetitions of the same task under the supervision and monitoring of a teacher. It is done for the motive of improving one's performance. It's highly demanding in terms of effort, and it is not inherently enjoyable. And Ericsson suggested, or rather proposed, that to achieve a high performance, one should start doing deliberate practice at a very young age and subsequently maximize the amount of deliberate practice at any age. Because they assumed the monotonic benefit assumption, which says that the more deliberate practice you have accumulated through your career, the higher your performance will be. Problems about it, why did it get so popular? Because there were no other better theories at that period of time. And I think because it's so simple. Anybody can become a high performer if you just invest enough time in deliberate practice, right? This is so attractive because it's so simple and because anybody can become a high achiever, which is, of course, paradox, because if everybody does more deliberate practice, they neutralize each other and not everybody will become successful, right? Yeah. So in sports, there's only one gold medal. Even if we all did 40 hours per week deliberate practice, only one of us will become a gold medalist.
That's exactly what I tell a lot of high-level golfers when I work with them. Let's say they're playing on a mini tour, they're not on the PGA or LPGA or European tour. It's like, so where you're at now, is the reason you're not at that next level, is it just time? do you need to double? You need to go from 40 to 80 hours of practice? Is that really what is stopping you from reaching that level? It doesn't make sense, because then if that's the variable, you can't just add on time to practice. Otherwise, you just wouldn't sleep and you just keep practicing. But that's not the difference between where you are and the person that's maybe 200 or 300 positions higher in the world rankings than you.
Absolutely. And I first read that article from 1993 when I was doing my habilitation. So in Germany, to be a professor, you have to do a post-PhD, another post-PhD thesis, which is about the double of a PhD. Well, never mind. And I did a literature research, and I read the deliberate practice, the idea of deliberate practice. I didn't pay any attention to it because I had experience as a coach, and I just didn't recognize what the empirical correspondence, because I knew that empirical reality works totally differently, right? And you don't find, or I couldn't find in my observation of real life practice, I couldn't find the correspondence, right? And so I did refer to it, but just once within 600 pages, right? And just once within a list of a number of authors, right? So the flaws are threefold. First, it is just impossible that everybody becomes a gold medalist, right? So that was the first theoretical flaw in the original idea of deliberate practice. Everybody can become a high performer, but high performance is always socially comparative, right? And we will always have a ranking. There will be a first, an eighth, and a 20th place, and a 250th place, right? Even if we all doubled our deliberate practice, if it did improve our performance, as Ericsson told, right? Second, the definition of deliberate practice was done a priori, not a posteriori. It was not done based on empirical research. Yeah, it's a synthetic a priori. That's the term from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. So that is that you draw conclusions based on initial premises without testing them in reality, right? So what Ericsson and his team did was they cogitated what may be characteristics of effective practice. Then they asked, from those ideas, they asked the violinists, the young adult violinists, do you think so? So certain characteristics and certain types of music activity, practice, playing, performing, alone or in groups and so on. How effective do you think it is for your performance? How enjoyable do you perceive it? And how much effort does it require? Right? Because a priori, they thought that those three characteristics are characteristics of effective practice. That is, it improves your performance, is highly effortful, but not inherently enjoyable. Right? Now, within the empirical results from those violinists, there were a number of other activities that those violinists also thought were very effective on their performance. For example, practicing in groups. But Ericsson and colleagues omitted that activity from their subsequent research. Right? One. The second flaw is that the motive to do an activity was defined as they do it for the purpose of improving their performance. That was a criterion of deliberate practice. They concluded that from the interviews with young adult violinists, and then they assumed that if those 23-year-old violinists have the motive to improve their performance when practicing, this would have been the same when they were 12 or when they were 6, right? But you just can't do that transfer. You can't draw that conclusion, right? At the same time, you can't record it. You can't ask them, what was your motive when you were 6? Because motives cannot be recorded reliably in retrospection, right? Second. And third, yes, clearly the empirical evidence is counters the basic premises of the idea of deliberate practice, or we'd rather say that deliberate practice is inconsistent. The idea of deliberate practice is inconsistent with the empirical evidence. because world-class athletes accumulated less coach-led main sport practice than national class athletes did.
And that's why I want to move into this talent development pathway, because really, I find it quite conflicting that what the evidence suggests and how actually most institutions and organizations are set up. So can you talk about the role of this early specialization in talent development pathways? Because it seems very prevalent that essentially nowadays, if you want to have any chance, you need to be in these pathways very early on, which can be conflicting with the idea that you should continue be playing other sports well into your as a child to help facilitate long-term development.
Right. Yes. So first of all, early specialization is not a scientific term, and it's not an accurate scientific concept for two reasons. First, it suggests there was one participation pattern that is opposed to one other. So there's some sort of dichotomous participation patterns, which is just not true. And second, it's a compound of many participation variables, where each of those participation variables can be measured directly. Right? We don't need that workaround of early specialization if we can measure the activities people engaged in directly, and we can even measure them as parametric variables. So the amount of types of activities, starting age, across how many years one did an activity, how many times per week, how many hours per week, it can all be measured directly, right? So early specialization, there are more than 100 different definitions of what early specialization is supposed to be in the literature. Mostly it is associated with early start. So start playing a sport at a young age and doing high amounts of specialized practice in that sport. And mostly it's also associated with rapid performance progress during early years of one's career. So that's mostly three attributes that are being described when talking about early specialization. The empirical evidence says that each of those three premises is false, and the opposite is true. Okay, you were asking for talent development pathways. Again, talent development pathways is not a scientific term. It's not a scientific concept. It's rather a concept of sports federations who try to draw some image of how does one develop towards a high performer in one sport. In all cases, they do not apply to individual athletes, right? But those concepts of pathways are an instrument of communication within a federation and between sport organizations, rather than an attempt to reflect empirical reality. Why? Because individual athlete pathways are idiosyncratic. There are no two identical pathways. Every athlete has his or her pathway, and they differ. Nevertheless, we can extract differences and commonalities, right? And yes, there are some commonalities within the individual differences, which we have already been talking about, right? So if sport organizations seek to formulate recommendations to practitioners, coaches, other sport organizations, so for example, talent development programs, and also to parents, they should be aware of a few truths. First, early talent identification is not possible, and therefore an early valid talent selection for talent development programs is also not possible at a young age, right? Next, involvement or early selection and involvement in talent development programs at a young age is negatively correlated with long-term senior performance, right? World-class athletes were selected for the first time into selection teams or squads at an older age than senior national class athletes were, right? So early involvement in talent development programs or talent promotion programs, perhaps rather, do not have a beneficial effect. They have a detrimental effect on long-term senior performance development, right? So second, we have to be aware of that. And third, relatedly, sport organizations have to be aware that when they select so-called positively identified talents at a young age, they have to be aware that the future high performers are most probably not among those early selected, but they're still outside that selection pool, right? And that has implication for sport organizations, especially talent development or talent promotion programs. But the focus should rather be on the young athletes outside my selection rather than within my selection, right? I sometimes have to do a selection because I need a selection team to compete against another federal state or another school or another nation, right? So we sometimes have to do selection, but we have to be aware that those who are selected early are most probably not the future high performers, while the future high performers are most probably still outside my selection, right? And summing this all up implies that any sport organization, including talent development programs, make a decision. This may be more or less conscious, this may be more or less informed, but they make a decision to either reinforce rapid junior performance at the expense of long-term senior performance, or to facilitate long-term development of a high senior performance at the expense of early youth performance, right? And based on the results that we've been discussing, I think the conclusion is clear that the best talent development, talent promotion is to protect them from excess demands at a young age. Demands, for example, regarding time, regarding health, regarding their body, regarding psychological well-being, and so on. So rather limit specialized practice in one's main sport, provide opportunities and encourage engagement in various sports. Performance development is not a hurry at that age, but as we mentioned earlier, it happened more slowly at the initial years in those who were the most successful athletes when they were adults.
And how do you, from your insights in Europe, in Germany, how would you grade the organizations in terms of, you said it's pretty much they have to choose one or the other. What is your perspective on what is the current state? Do you see any changes? Do you see any examples of kind of forward thinking, or ones that are embracing what the research is showing?
Oh, yes, sure, absolutely. So first of all, coaches are always interested in what's new, and they're much more rational in dealing with new scientific evidence than sport organizations are, right? Because of sport organizations, well, okay, this would lead too far. But there are also sport organizations. So the NBA is a good example. Youth NBA, they're concerned about those tendencies to ever more an earlier specialization of youth basketball players, knowing that this is detrimental to the long-term development of senior players, right? UK Sport has reformed their whole system of talent selection and talent development. The Scandinavian countries do. I mean, Denmark and Norway, they even have national laws on childhood sport, right? Protecting children from over demands, right? Personally, we're working with a number of youth soccer academies that traditionally start at a very young age to selecting assigned talents, sometimes even at under 8, right? And yeah, there are a handful of youth soccer academies that we work with who are interested in that research and who are taking steps to react and change their system. Actually, yes, it happens.
Mm. And generally, though, I mean, I'm a big football fan, soccer fan. Nowadays, it is pretty much focused on, I mean, the age of players playing in the top leagues is getting younger and younger. I could imagine it's very difficult to make those kind of changes within a structure where they're trying to get players, as young as possible, or they're just happening to get younger and younger. They're starting for their national team, they're starting for their club because they can bring in, I mean, the amount of money going around for these players nowadays is mind-boggling, right? So I could imagine that it's very difficult to be like to convince, or even if obviously the research is there to support it, it's not that you're presenting just your opinion on it, but I could imagine that's definitely can be an uphill battle.
Partly, yeah. So first of all, the age of professional players has actually not changed over the last over recent decades.
Okay.
There have always been those prodigies who already played in the first league at age 17. There's just one difference that two years ago, the German first league decided to admit 16-year-old players because there was one player who was assumed to be 16 and they wanted him to play on the first team, right? But so Lothar Matthäus was also 17, just 17 years old when he started playing in the first German football or soccer league, right? Okay, so those youth soccer academies, they started to develop about 40 years ago. So Ajax Amsterdam was the example. They did such a youth soccer academy. They were very successful in developing successful adult players. So they were the example for others. And about 20 years ago, most countries started to establish most football leagues started to establish those youth soccer academies. And today we got them all over the world, even in most developing countries. There are even partnerships between professional clubs in Western Europe and youth soccer academies in Africa or South America, right? So the European club is paying the youth academy in, say, Nigeria, for example, right? What they all have in common is they lowered the admission age more and more over the years. And today the situation is that they all recognize and acknowledge that this is problematic, this is stressful, it is strainful for both the young players and the coaches and the organization because it causes a lot of problems, right? Problems in terms of injuries in later years, problems in terms of reduced educational performance, academic performance, problems in terms of unhappy children because they leave their home club, some of them leave their family and so on. So huge opportunity costs. And they also observe that it really, that early talent promotion and selection does not really facilitate future top senior players, right? They're all aware of that, but nobody wants to be the first one to move, right? Because they're afraid that if I increase my selection age, say from 10 to 14, then my worry is that the other clubs will, how do you say that? Okay, so they will cover the best talents in their club. They're
going to take away those. They're going to be taken by another club.
Yeah. So that's what everybody is afraid of. But there have been reaction to that, and just these days or maybe these years, changes are happening. So the best German or the most successful German club, Bayern München, they have just decided this year to raise the age of initial selection from 8 to 12. Okay. That is 4 years. That's a lot. That's a lot at that age, right? They decided for themselves without having to do so.
Yeah.
Right? So they have a circle around their site.
Yeah.
Of say 50 kilometers and 80 kilometers, right? Mm-hmm. And so they decided we do not recruit players who live further away than those 50 kilometers up to age 14.
Interesting.
Right? And no players who live further away than those 80 kilometers up to age 16.
Interesting.
Right? We do not run residential, so internats.
Yeah, like where the kids can live kind of boarding. They board there and they live
Yes,
there. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, we don't run boarding below 15 or 16 years, for example. Why before they did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that this caused a lot of problems, and the children were just not happy.
Yeah.
Right, leaving home at 12 to become a football player and so on, right? So yes, we can observe some really reasonable changes.
Got it. I have one more topic related to perfectionism, and then I want to kind of try and wrap things together to conclude. But there was also a paper I read called The Great British Medalist Project, a review of current knowledge on the development of the world's best sporting talent. And I just been reading a lot more about burnout related to perfectionism. And so this is kind of changing gears a bit here, but one of the paragraphs that stood out to me is there is also evidence at non-elite, elite, and super elite level that athletes display adaptive perfectionism, a tendency to maintain perspective on performance while striving to achieve exceptional standards. This contrasts with the many negative outcomes associated with maladaptive perfectionism. Just because I've actually, in later episodes, I'm going to be talking also about perfectionism. Nothing really to do with what we've talked with so far, but can you touch on that? Because actually I've been reading a lot about how, perfectionism is detrimental, but this nuanced difference was interesting to see that there can be positive perfectionism that's not only going to cause, depressive symptoms and burnout and want people to stop playing their sport or pursue some sort of activity.
So I'm not a psychologist, but as far as I understand my colleagues, it's exactly as you say, that striving for perfection per se is not necessarily detrimental, and it may even be facilitative for one's development. So children love learning. Children love to learn, and they love to improve, right? And they love to work on their improvement, which is much more important for a child or an adolescent, working on their improvement. So the activity itself, then the result, right? And consequences like recognition and prestige and so on, right? Or placing in a competition. So children love learning. They love working on their improvement, which may be related to some sort of perfectionism, right? So perfect oneself. There's nothing wrong with that. But there seems to be some point at which it turns detrimental and hampering. As far as I understand, is when there are strong, rigid external performance expectations, and if one is has perfectionist tendencies, not intrinsically because I love learning and I love improving and I love performing, but because I want to fulfill others' expectations.
That's a very important distinguishing point, and I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's very important also in terms of talent development, player development, is that balance on which side of that spectrum or where they're falling with that, because perfectionism can be to a certain extent positive and encouraging if someone's doing it for their own sake and the sake of wanting to get better for themselves.
There are some people who think and say and propose we have to protect children from competitions. Because competition is bad because there's always a winner and a loser, and there are many more losers than winners. So competition is detrimental to children's well-being. Nonsense. Children love competing, and they don't care about the ranking. What they love is the situation of the competition when everything is still uncertain. And so what they love is this small space between the starting line and the finish line, what happens in between. That's what children love and adolescents love. While the adults are those who are interested on what happens after the finish line, so ranking, podium, and so on. Children don't care about that. When children play leisure soccer on the schoolyard or in the park and so on, right? The result of the game is 14-2. What are they going to do next? They change the teams, right? Yeah. They make different teams so that the next match will be 7-7, right? Yeah. And that shows us, because if they cared about the result and consequences of the result, the one team, the winner team, would say, no, we're not changing. We're staying the same teams. But they don't. They say, no, this is becoming boring. We want an exciting game where the result is uncertain, and what we most love is that it is a match in terms of matched counterparts.
Yeah.
Right. We asked a number of very high performing senior athletes, including the Olympic champion team in field hockey of the London 2012 Games. And some of the questions we asked them is, when do they love to engage in a competition most? And response options were, for example, when my direct counterpart player is in bad shape today or is in top shape today. When it's already clear before the match who is going to win the duels, the one-on-one duels, or when it is uncertain who's going to win the one-on-one duels, and so on, right? And I mean, these were gold medalists, and they loved those matches where everything was uncertain, and not where they knew they were superior to the other, right? And that shows us that okay, these were senior athletes, but that's the key of children competing. I mean, even if we don't organize competitions for children, they will organize competitions themselves. They play hide and seek, they play catching, they play, and maybe even sport games like soccer, right? And they do that because they love competing. And there's nothing wrong with children competing. It's not detrimental if competition is understood accurately. What matters is the situation of the competition. So that small space between the starting and the finish line, and not the result and what happens afterwards.
Very interesting. What advice would you have for parents raising golfers, or just in general raising, children that might have some sort of interest in pursuing athletic endeavors in the future? So that would be any insights you have, kind of links to what you just talked about, really, about, okay, it's okay for my kids to engage in competition as long as it's about that process, but the time between the start and the finish. But was there anything else you would want to share with a family that's raising a golfer that you would want them to know?
With pleasure. As a parent, on the one hand, I want to provide my children opportunities to do sports and opportunities to do various sports, and encourage them to do various sports. And even if doing another sport besides golf is at the expense of 1 or 2 weekly golf sessions, at the long term, the benefit will be greater, right? So it'll be beneficial if they do 1 or 2 other sports besides golf, or maybe even before starting golf, right? There were also world-class athletes who did one sport first. Say they started doing artistic gymnastics at 6 and did it until 14, but at 10 they started doing athletics, so there was a 4-year overlap, and then at 14 they resigned from artistic gymnastics, and now they were just track and field athletes, right? So we would call, or many would call them early specializers, because from 6 to 10 they were only artistic gymnasts, right? In golf, it is not so important to start at a very young age. There are examples who only started in mid or late adolescence and still became very good golf players, right? So there's no reason to hurry or to pressure. So on the one hand, provide opportunities to do golf, to do other sports besides golf, but at the same time, the responsibility as a father, or my wife as a mother, is to protect our child from over demands, or from excess demands regarding their time, regarding their body, their health, but also regarding their psychological well-being, right? And that's the greater responsibility, because from the empirical evidence, we find that the predictors of enjoyment in sports, of long-term engagement and prolonged engagement, of psychological well-being of a child, they are very similar to the predictors of long-term performance. So in other words, what makes happy and healthy children also facilitates long-term performance development, right? That's why I'm saying, as a father, as a mother, our responsibility is to protect our children from excess demand.
I love that. Very clear and to the point. So I think for anyone listening, I think that is very valuable information to consider and reflect on. My last 2 points really to conclude are just, can you talk about any current projects you're working on, anything you can share there? And if you had any book or research paper recommendations, just in general, it doesn't have to be even related to what we talked about today, just things that inspired you or left an impact in your life at some point or currently.
Yeah, so what we're currently doing is the same team, Michael Bart, Brooke McNamara, Zach Hamburg, and me. We're currently researching the role of junior performance on senior performance. In concrete, it's how many elite junior athletes become senior elite athletes and how many senior elite athletes were junior elite athletes. And from that, we can calculate, from those findings, we can calculate to what extent successful juniors and successful seniors are one identical population, or rather largely two disparate populations. You may guess the result.
Yeah. Okay.
Recommended books to read. I think any researcher should have read Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery, should have read Lakatosh's Methodology of Scientific Research Program, should have read Merton's Ethos of Pure Science. Now, for practitioners, say, for example, in sport organizations, federations, sport academies, and so on, Niels Brunson from Sweden, first published in 1989, and the second edition was in 2002. The Organization of Hypocrisy: Talk, Decision, and Actions in Organizations. That's
Okay.
that is the best read to understand how organizations work.
Interesting. I'm going to look that up. Okay. Great. That's awesome. That's why I always like asking that question, because I always learn of a new book that I need to look into, or a research paper that I need to look into. So, okay. Oh, great. Well, was there anything else you wanted to add? So, I mean, that we haven't touched
I don't
on?
think so.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I've learned a lot. And I appreciate the balance of here's what the scientific evidence suggests, balanced with, but here is where we're not able to make concrete claims. And I think that's really valuable and often missing in today's world. Is it's easy just to make statements without actually referencing, is the scientific literature matching that? So I appreciate you finding that balance today. And I will include in the notes the papers, the books that Dr. Güllich just mentioned. I will include all that. Dr. Güllich, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you too.
That was my conversation with Dr. Arne Güllich. If you enjoyed today's podcast episode, consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. All the relevant links from today's episode and to my newsletter will be linked below. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.